Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, where we take you back to the good old days. Just maybe not exactly how you'd expect from our title. I am Megan Cox.
And I am Clayton Becker. And Megan, what are we going to be talking about today?
Today, we are rejecting term limits and embracing electoral accountability. Yet again, unfortunately, we have a news hook.
Yeah, okay, so we have a news hook on this one. I really do promise that we plan these without regard for what's happening in the news. Like, we really do. But I also think, given the particular news hook that we have, I guess maybe just in case some people hadn't heard of it, just in case it's maybe faded a little bit from our public perceptions by the time this episode releases, the news hook is that Donald Trump is pursuing ways to find a third term in the White House. And to contextualize that news hook, we want to make it super clear right out of the gate. We are not talking about term limits for the executive, like for the executive branch, for governors, for the president, for like mayors of cities, for prime ministers, whatever. Like, even though prime ministers have a whole different set of
setup. Anyway. I don't even know how you do that, but yeah, we are talking about legislative term limits. There are important arguments in favor of executive term limits that just don't apply to the legislature. So we want to very specifically say we are talking about legislative members, House of Representatives and senators in particular in the U.S. context.
Yeah, in both the U.S. Congress as well as in the various states that have term limits. And the reason behind this is basically because although everybody loves term limits, like almost literally everybody, according to a Pew Research Center poll from 2023, 87% of Americans support term limits, including 90% of Republicans, 86% of Democrats, 81% of people aged 18 to 29, 85% of those 30 to 49, 90% of those 50 to 64, and 91% of those 65 or older. Additionally, people say they'd be way more likely to support candidates if they say they'd support term limits, like in surveys, all of this. Politicians frequently run on term limits, promising to support them. There's this huge, broad-based popular consensus that everyone loves term limits and we should do term limits.
Ironically, not to steal your thunder here, all of these people still vote for incumbents.
True. Okay, yes. But anyway, despite the fact that everybody loves term limits, despite the fact that there is near universal support for term limits.
The concept of term limits.
For the concept of term limits, political scientists almost universally hate them. And Megan and I are no exception. As political scientists, we hate term limits.
They are dumb, bad, and wrong.
They are dumb, bad, and wrong. In that order, basically, quite frankly. There are, I think, few topics in the social sciences where the research is as uniform as it is on term limits, that they are bad, that they just do not work, and that they have lots of unintended consequences. So with that in mind, with that preamble in mind, everybody supports them, except for the people who study this for a living. Before we get into the empirical research a little bit, we should maybe explain a little bit more of sort of the abstract mechanics of elections, like what we think elections are sort of actually doing at like a top line level. Abstracting
it's gonna get real nerdy for a second. We're
gonna get extremely nerdy. This is like, Megan and I talk about a lot of stuff on this show that we like know a lot about and research a lot about, but this is something that Megan and I are like actually bona fide experts about. So you'll have to bear with us for a moment here. Basically, abstracting away from partisanship and policy for a moment. Like, I know.
Suspend your disbelief.
Suspend your disbelief, bear with us. This will make sense in a couple of minutes. Abstracting away from partisanship and policy, elections are fundamentally an accountability mechanism in what we call a principal-agent relationship. Megan, do you want to explain what the principal-agent model is, since you're the one who teaches the Congress class?
Sure. Essentially, I mean, for people who are not familiar with it, a principal is somebody who has authority for some reason, and the agent is the person that they delegate that authority to. Imagine if you hire someone to go paint your house, for example. You have the authority to do whatever to your house, and you're giving them very specific instructions about what you want done to your house. They are acting with your authority. They are your agent. In the principal agent model of elected government, the people are the principals.
Yeah,
we voters. Are the voters. We are the sovereign with the authority. And we give our authority to members of Congress or whomever we're electing in a particular election to do what we want them to do on our behalf. Because if you think about it, we have this sort of like ancient Greek demos idea of democracy where everybody gets together, or, the New England town meetings where everybody gets together and talks about everything together. We have too many people to do that.
Yeah, it just doesn't work.
In a representative democracy, we're picking a few people to go act on our behalf in the state or national capital. That's the principal-agent relationship in a nutshell for people who are not familiar with this literature.
And so basically what the principal-agent model is in the political context is we as voters are saying to our representatives, go and represent my interests faithfully. That's sort of like the top line thing that voters are telling politicians to do, right? Whether your interests are, partisan, whether they are, distributive, what have you, right? Like, you want your representative to go to Congress and you want them to act in what you see as your best interest. So getting funding for the district, helping to bring, new projects, helping to improve the economy, helping to make sure that, gay people and trans people and non-white people have rights and stuff like that.
Stuff like that. Good stuff. Yeah.
And so the election piece of this is the accountability mechanism in the principal agent model.
Because yes, if your agent starts to act outside of what you have said you want them to do, then that last election, whatever the last election is your opportunity to revoke that agency that you have granted them. You take it back and you say, you're doing it wrong. I'm going to select this other person to go and act with my authority because you have misused it.
Yeah, so say that you have a representative who you've elected who is just quite frankly dog shit at getting funding for the district, perhaps, right? Again, to maybe abstract a little bit away from sort of partisan political concerns. They're just not good at getting federal funding for anything, right? And so because they are not faithfully representing your interests in getting federal funding for various things in the district, you decide to boot them out of office and elect someone else that will hopefully represent your interests more faithfully. That's the accountability mechanism of the principal agent model. However, getting rid of that final election, as Megan said, so to speak, means that during their final term in office, a given elected official has no external incentive to work in their constituents' best interest. They know they can't be reelected. They know they cannot face accountability, right? And so they have no motivation other than their sort of own internal intrinsic motivation to do anything productive for the people who elected them to represent them. And you might think, well, that's the kind of person we want. We want someone in office who has this internal intrinsic motivation to do good things for the district. But the challenge is that we live in the real world, not a fantasy world where everyone is drawn to public service because they are, these paragons of virtue, but often because they are megalomaniacs obsessed with power, and frankly, wants to exercise it over others. And it's hard to tell the difference.
It takes a certain type of person to want to be in Congress. And the Venn diagram of people who like power and people who are pursuing power for only virtuous, altruistic reasons, there's not as much overlap there as you would kind of hope.
Yeah. And so this lack of an external accountability mechanism is responsible for the first tranche of problems that term limits can cause. which is basically that legislators just don't work as hard if they don't have to face voters again. I'm going to throw a few studies at you here now. There's a 2018 study from Hall and Fournier that basically finds that legislators who can no longer seek re-election sponsor fewer bills, so they write fewer pieces of legislation. They are less productive on committees, and they are absent for more floor votes. So they actually miss more of the basic piece of the job, which is voting for pieces of legislation on the floor of the legislature. Oh, and I suppose I should contextualize how we know all of this, which is that there are a number of states that have term limits. Right? We don't have term limits in Congress or in the Senate, but we do have term limits in 16 states around the country, which have been adopted since the early 1990s, ranging from fairly small states all the way up to some of the most populous states, like Florida and California. Both have term limits for their legislators. So when we say legislators who can no longer seek re-election, we mean legislators in their final term in these term-limited states, basically. And
then we can compare them to the states that don't have those term limits.
Yes,
so that's very useful.
Precisely. And we can also compare them to themselves in years where they could seek re-election.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So we're so Megan is a member of the Oregon State Legislature or whatever. In her second to last term, she does XYZ, right? And then in her last term, where she cannot face voters, where she cannot get reelected, she does less work, basically, is the long story short. And then on top of that, we have
senioritis, basically.
Yes, literally senioritis in Congress, 100%. And then on top of that, legislators who are working in these term-limited bodies who want to continue on to higher office and who know that they have less time in order to do that because of the term limits, they spend less time on things like constituency service activities and significantly more time on fundraising. And that's a 2018 paper by Vendusky Allen.
And I think we need to stop and kind of observe how surprising the constituency services finding is. Because you would expect that if you are about to face voters for any kind of office, you would be doing more constituency service work. But if you're expanding your electorate, maybe it isn't useful. If you are trying to move from a state legislative district, which is smaller than a U.S. House district or a U.S. Senate district, you need to spend more time thinking about more voters than you previously did.
You need to spend time thinking about voters who you do not currently represent, right? And more time thinking about fundraising from voters who you do not currently represent. I think it might also be helpful to contextualize just a little bit what we mean when we say constituency service, because I feel like people don't have a great sense of what those activities actually are. Megan, do you want to take this, explain a little bit more of what?
Yeah. Sure. So I think I've shared this story before, but just as a little example of what constituency services can look like. If you're experiencing a problem with your government, either at the state or federal level, you can enlist the assistance of your elected representative in your legislative body to go and kind of do a little fact finding, figure out what the exact problem is that is holding up whatever benefit that you think you need to receive, whatever problem you're having. My example is my aunt and uncle moved from Washington to Oregon, tried to transfer over some benefits that they received for taking care of my cousin who's profoundly disabled. They couldn't get the money, and this is money that they need to care for my cousin. They called their state representative. Their state representative talked to the appropriate department on their behalf, found the problem, and the checks started coming. That's an option that exists in this country. This is actually, I have learned, a totally foreign concept to other people in other countries. This doesn't work like this. But in the US context, constituency services means enlisting the help of your representative or official to go and kind of poke at the administrative apparatus of the state.
Yeah, and another big one of these is people getting expedited passports or getting help with things like birth certificates and other documents that you need. And You might think that this sounds sort of trivial and that it sounds like stuff that maybe not many people take advantage of, but Congress people and state representatives spend a lot of time on constituency service.
And you also
both
never
them
know
and
when
their
you're going to need
staffs.
it. A friend of mine got deported from the UK because there was a problem with his student visa. And like his parents had to call his senator to figure out where he was, like, because nobody was communicating with them because he was technically an adult. You never know when you're going to need this, but when you need it, you need it.
Yeah, when you need it, you need it. And term limits seem to make representatives spend less time on those really important activities, which is a bad thing, right? It means that fewer people are able to take advantage of those constituency services. It means that people are they're actually getting harmed by the fact that their member of the legislature does not spend as much time doing this kind of work. I think I can't remember exactly what the figure was, but something like between a quarter and a third of all staff time in the California state legislature is spent just on constituency service activities.
I would absolutely believe that.
Yeah,
and
I don't
it's
know
a big chunk of your staff too.
Yeah. Like it's much more like district-based staff spend more of their time on constituency service than DC-based staff. And I don't know what it looks like for Congress or for other state legislatures. I just remember this with reference to California. Sorry for our listeners outside of the state. But the basic upshot of this point is that term limits seem to make representatives less concerned with actually representing people and actually helping them with their problems, which is not great. It's not great, especially when basically the idea behind term limits is that we're going to get better people into office who will do those things more effectively. Like term limits actively backfire in this way. But this is far from the only problem that term limits can cause. Being a representative, being a legislator, contrary to popular belief, perhaps, is actually something that you can get better at over time, that you get good at over time.
It's a skill position, guys. I know we want to think that it's, a bunch of yahoos. The yahoos get the attention, I gotta tell you.
They do.
There is a selection bias towards the clips that float around on social media being more outlandish or more stupid. But being very good at being a legislator is an incredible skill. There's a reason Nancy Pelosi is legendary.
Yeah.
It's not because she's just a nice Italian grandma. She is a master of the rules and a master of understanding what makes different legislators tick, and you don't get that on your first or second term.
I absolutely don't, right? And I think that the critical piece here is that, not just being a legislator, but all of these other skills that go into effectively running a congressional office or a state legislative office are things that you get better at over time. Because it's not just reading, writing, passing legislation, moving things through the legislative process. It's things like hiring effective staff members, being an effective delegator and personnel manager.
And the more senior you get, the better staff you get.
Yes.
People leave and you get their staff kind of thing.
And also being, good at communicating, being good at this constituency service stuff.
Knowing who to call.
Yeah, developing the relationships within the government that you need to have in order to effectively do the constituency service. These are all things that you get better at over time, right? Maybe some people don't get much better at them over time, the yahoos, right? But the people who are actually there to do the real fucking job, right? They get better at it over time. And limiting the amount of time that people can spend in office means that you get less skilled legislators on average. So I'm about to throw another set of findings at you here. First, legislators in term-limited states are less likely to challenge the decisions of the governor or to screen legislation carefully. For the same reason, term limits also seem to increase the power of bureaucrats, who obviously do not have term limits, and staffers, as Megan just said, who work for multiple members as those members are term limited. And very, very importantly, term limits increase the power of lobbying organizations who represent the same interests year after year and who stick around as members of the legislature turn over. I think this bit about lobbyist power being increased in state legislatures with term limits is one, the like worst finding normatively speaking. Like, term limits are intended to increase fidelity between people and their government, like increase how well they represent you and follow your policy preferences. But it actually does exactly the opposite. And then I also think that this finding is probably like the most robust finding of all of the ones in the literature on this.
Over and over and over, we find
I'd say close to like half a dozen studies that I am aware of find this finding, that term limits do in fact make lobbying power much greater than non-term limited states.
It makes intuitive sense. I don't necessarily know that we have to spend a ton of time belaboring the point, but just as, kind of an analogous example, I worked for an organization where we were frequently in debates with a advocate on the other side who had been there for probably 20 or 30 years, making the same arguments over and over and over again. And we on our side, we had turnover every 2 or 3 years. And so this guy across the table from us, sometimes I do think he was just making it up. He'd say, 10 years ago we tried that and blah, blah, blah. And you go, okay, well, I guess that won't work.
And no one on your side of the table actually knew, right? Whether that was the case. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I think the intuition here is even like broader though, I think, right? Like, imagine, for instance, that you're like working at just a regular old business, right? And like the most tenured person in your company, like the most tenured person, or maybe let's say the most tenured person in your department, right? Can only be in that role for 10 years. And so at any given time, the most senior person in your department has been there for 10 years. But your clients, people in other departments, people in companies that you work with, they can all stick around for as long as they want, right? It's pretty easy to see how the people in your department, in your role, would be more easily influenced by all of those other people because they've been around for longer. They have more institutional knowledge. As Megan suggested, they could theoretically just make things up about what we tried before and what worked and what didn't, right? And you'd have no idea whether or not they were telling you the truth.
Maybe this other person was right and we had done exactly what he said, but he definitely had the power in that negotiation.
Yeah. And term limits do this on a huge scale, just an absolutely huge scale. But that's not even everything. Like, there's still that's not even all of the bad consequences of term limits. Let's throw a few additional findings at people. Term limits also seem to worsen the problem of corruption, particularly the problem of ex-legislators going and working for corporations and lobbying firms after their terms in office are over. They actually seem to make polarization worse, and they worsen the gap between what people want and what actually ends up happening. And on top of all of this, they actually seem to worsen voter turnout, not improve it. Places that have term-limited legislators see 1 to 2 points lower voter turnout than do places without term-limited legislators, which is kind of shitty. And although you might think 1 to 2 points doesn't sound like a lot, in the elections literature, that's like basically the largest turnout effect.
Margin.
That's the largest turnout effects that you get in this literature. Like, broadly speaking, the people who are going to vote are already voting, right? And you move things around at the margin. But also you have to contextualize that 1 to 2% is thousands of people, right? Tens of thousands of people in the largest, highest turnout districts, right? It's just really bad. Like, it worsens the quality of democracy. Like, apart from all of the other stuff that we've talked about before, it means that fewer people are actually going to the polls and trying to be principals for whatever agent is going to take over. Like, it's just bad all the way down, quite frankly.
It's yes. I have nothing to add to the point that it's just bad all the way down.
In the interest of not belaboring the point too much, I'm just going to run through literally all of the negative consequences that we have on the page here in our notes, and then we'll take a bit of a break and we'll talk about maybe what we can do here. But In addition to increasing ideological polarization, term limits seem to make co-sponsorship networks, information sharing, negotiation, and legislative relationships more insular, which results in chamber leadership having significantly more power and control. And then on top of all of that, it's not like we're actually having a trade-off here. Right? Like,
what are we actually trying to do with term limits? Why do people think that term limits lead to more faithful representation? What is that?
People think this, but like it's literally it's fully not true.
Steel man it for me, man. Why is this supposed to be good?
So term limits are supposed to do a number of things. They are supposed to make the government more financially sustainable, more financially responsible. They are supposed to help with getting more women and people of color elected as older, white representatives.
You have older white representatives not camping out in their seats?
Yeah, as older white representatives are intended to, or are forced to retire, right? Following their being term limited out. They are supposed to reduce campaign spending and fundraising. They are supposed to lead as well to more competitive races.
Because you're limiting the incumbency.
Reducing the incumbency advantage, right? They're supposed to give people an opportunity to more effectively bring additional people into the legislature. They're supposed to make it easier for people to hold representatives accountable, right? And on top of all of that, they're supposed to, first and foremost, and probably more important than anything else, limit the amount of time that people are spending in politics. Because there's this pervasive popular belief that people who are in the legislature over time lose touch with the American people, lose the ability to represent them effectively. They get, too into the capital culture of whatever like state capital they're in or the national capital. And so they, just aren't from that place anymore. Right. And
so cell phone gazillionaire Daryl Issa was ever representative, but whatever.
Yeah, but this is the idea, right? The idea is that all of these things are supposed to solve these. Term limits are supposed to solve all of these problems, right?
Okay, so that's why we're trying this dumb thing.
Yes.
But you're saying it doesn't even do that.
It doesn't do any of those things, right?
Okay.
It's not like we have all of the bad stuff we talked about, and then we also get the things that term limits are supposed to do, right? And we're just making this trade-off. No, it's not like that at all. Term limits do not seem to achieve any of their stated goals. Previous research has found they have no impact on how financially and fiscally responsible representatives are or how well the state's finances are managed. They don't seem to help more women or people of color get elected. They don't reduce campaign spending or fundraising. They haven't led to more competitive races. They don't even lead people to actually spend that much less time in politics because people used to retire or lose in a way that made it harder for them to seek political office in the future. But
now if you get termed out, you can make a very good argument about moving to another position to running for re-election if your state has a setup where it's like you have to sit out 2 cycles and then you can run again. You're just going to run again and you've taken 8 years off or whatever.
Yeah, precisely, exactly. Nowadays, people, like in states that have term limits, people are much more likely to just return to local office following their time in the state legislature, and then they can continue to exert direct political power. Like, there's few term limits in local government, right? And so people who, are termed out in the state legislature just then run for the city council of whatever town they come from, or they run for the mayorship, or they run for a different legislative seat, or they try to serve on like the county board of supervisors, right? Like, if you get termed out, it's very easy, as you just said, for them to be like, well, I was doing fine. The only reason I had to leave the state legislature is because I was termed out. You guys had me represent you before. You want me to continue representing you in this other opportunity, right? Whereas before you would retire or you would lose and you would actually spend less time in government positions. Right?
Politics is a career, whether or not we try to make it hard.
Yeah.
It seems to be the answer. People have a very strong negative opinion of career politicians, and that is dumb, wrong, and bad because being in politics is a skill set that requires actual knowledge to do it effectively.
And I think that we have seen exactly the kind of consequences of having politicians who don't know what the fuck they're doing over the last 75 days of the Trump administration.
Who knew? Who knew it's important to know what the fuck you're talking about?
Yeah. Who knew that it is important to have fucking experience in the role that you're doing? Anyway, so all of that is like why term limits are bad, right? They're bad. They're just bad. I'll give one caveat, one additional steel manning to the argument of term limits, which is that term limits could operate differently in the US Congress. Theoretically, they could operate differently as opposed to in various states. We don't have any data on how this would work in Congress because there is no term limit in Congress. There have never been term limits in Congress. And Congress is also substantially more professionalized than any state legislature. California comes the closest to Congress's level of professionalism. But even in California, legislators are not paid as highly. They do not have the same level of staff. They do not have the same level of resources and departments within the Congressional Research Service and all of that, Congressional Budget Office. They don't have the same level of professionalism as people in the U.S. Congress do. So it could be that in this more professionalized legislature, where more people have more experience generally before getting there, that we don't see these negative impacts in the U.S. Congress. But to cut what could be an even longer story short, the fact is that in places where we have term limits, according to basically all of the available research, they simply do not achieve the goals that they are intended to achieve and have a ton of unintended consequences that end up making things worse rather than better. So yes, in theory, they could work differently in Congress, but all of the available evidence suggests that they probably wouldn't. And so maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't double down on what is clearly an ineffective strategy to do this in a much more important legislative body, quite frankly, than any state legislature is.
Fortunately, we do have some ideas as to how we might actually be able to achieve the things that people are trying to achieve when they support term limits. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we will discuss the many alternatives towards limiting incumbency advantage and otherwise making our legislatures better without empowering lobbyists.
Yes, indeed. All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. When we left you, we were talking about all of the problems that have resulted from term limits being implemented in various states. But now we want to talk to you about the alternatives, how we can actually embrace electoral accountability, and how we can solve the problems that term limits are intended to solve in the first place. Because all of the stuff in the first half of the episode said, the desire for term limits is born out of a genuine place of failure, I think, in our representative institutions. It's a genuine failure of electoral accountability, a lack of fidelity between people's preferences and the laws that actually end up getting passed. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we should do about it. Megan, what should we do about it?
Well, we should think about some other solutions that might get us to the goal that we seem to be chasing when we want to implement term limits. But before we take you through all of those solutions that we're going to propose, I do want to share a story. As I think I mentioned, I teach a Congress class, and one of my assignments for my students, the big paper at the end of the term, is to write some amendments to the U.S. Constitution that would make Congress better. Now, we talk about term limits in my class, and I teach my students about the issues specifically relating to how term limits make executives more powerful, bureaucracy more powerful, staff more powerful, and lobbyists more powerful. And yet, when I get those papers back at the end of the quarter, my students are still, maybe a third of them, including as one of their amendments, they want term limits. And I have chosen to interpret that as really a reflection of the deep-seated desire to in some way correct, among other things, the incumbency advantage, how easy it is relative to challengers for people who are already serving in the legislature to get themselves elected, or some of these other goals that people are pursuing when they say they want term limits, things like a more diverse legislature or less corruption, et cetera, et cetera. We have other ways to solve those problems that are not term limits, and we're going to take you through all of those.
Yes, I think that is a healthy interpretation there for you, Megan.
It's not that I'm failing, it's that the children have different desires.
Yes. It's not that they didn't agree with the research. It's the children that are wrong.
The children are still right, but we're all right. We're all right too, is kind of where I'm going with this.
Okay. So with that in mind, with this sort of deep-seated desire for term limits in mind, let's sort of walk everyone through, all of the listeners through, a few of the things that we can actually do here in order to achieve the goals that term limits set out to achieve, hopefully without also resulting in all of these unintended consequences that we blitzed through for you in the previous half hour. So I think that the first thing, and this is sort of like it's going to feel a little hand-wavy. It is a little hand-wavy. But when we're talking about accountability, the thing we really need to do is actually hold members accountable. Because right now, voters just simply are not doing that, right?
No one's holding a gun to your head and making you re-elect your incumbent.
Yeah, literally nobody is doing that, right?
You may feel that way.
Yes.
Because by the time you get to choose between the incumbent or an out partisan, it feels like there's a gun to your head. But in actuality...
Yeah, I think the thing is here that, we've talked about term limits being this thing that tries to deal with the incumbency advantage, basically. And I think you're right that that's the fundamental thing that term limits are trying to achieve here. But what we're really doing there, the real reason why we're relying on term limits to do that is because we're using them as a crutch almost for the fact that people are not engaged enough in politics to actually hold their representatives accountable. So the biggest thing that we could do, something that would actually work if we could achieve it, would be to engage in politics at more levels than we do right now. People really do not engage in politics. The large majority of people do not engage in politics beyond the national general election, by which we mean presidential elections every 4 years, basically. Turnout even in midterm elections is pretty abysmal, and it's even worse in places that hold off-cycle elections or in state legislative contests in general. Turnout in these elections is just absolutely atrocious. For instance, turnout in the New York mayoral election in 2021, when current horrible mayor Eric Adams was elected. I know it doesn't feel that long ago, but it was 4 fucking years ago. Turnout in that election was 21% of eligible voters. And turnout in the Los Angeles mayoral election in 2022 was 43%. And that election happened at the same time as the 2022 midterms, which were a historically high midterm turnout, right? People just do not show up in these elections. They don't show up in local elections. They don't show up in state legislative contests, and they don't show up in primaries. Stephen Rogers, who is a professor at, I think, St. Louis University, not WashU in St. Louis, but just St. Louis University, has a book called Accountability in State Legislatures.
Moonlights in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but yeah.
What?
Steve Rogers?
I hate you. I hate you so much. Anyway.
We are real people with real lives. Continue.
Stephen Rogers, not Captain America,
sadly,
but professor at, I think, St. Louis University. I think
I'm sure nobody ever makes that joke to him.
Basically, he finds that there is no accountability in state legislatures. Basically, a substantial proportion of state legislators do not face anyone in the primary, and a similar proportion, regardless of whether they face someone in the primary election, don't then have to go face someone in the general. It's somewhere on the order of 40% of all state legislators in the country basically achieve re-election not having to actually face a real opponent. That's like nearly half, right? 40%. Nearly half of all state legislators do not even face an electoral challenge. They get reelected.
So rather than running people against state legislators, states choose term limits as the make everything worse button just to try and fix this problem, because it is easier.
It is easier, yes.
Than coming up with a concerted plan to run an opponent in each of the however many districts your state has. But they're not, state parties and local officials are not engaging in that act of politics in a way that holds members accountable without the term limits.
Yes. In short, term limits are a lazy option for dealing with the fact that people are not engaged enough to actually hold members accountable for bad behavior. And it's a similar story at the local level. Lots of city council members do not face a primary challenge if they're in a city council that has partisan elections, or they don't face a significant challenger in the general. Lots of people across the board in state contests and local contests are just simply not facing a challenge, not even being attempted to hold people accountable. And instead of doing the work of actually trying to hold them accountable, people want to push the term limits button, the make everything worse button, because it is easier, as you said.
And it's really interesting when you get into the literature on this. I think it's actually in Roger's book, kind of trying to consider, it's not just the act of having to go out and defend yourself or having to possibly lose a re-election campaign. The knowledge that you can have a challenger, that your community will likely, if they are not satisfied with your performance, put forward someone to contest your re-election. It makes you be more proactive in how closely you adhere to your community's expectations in that principal agent relationship. So if a legislator has been getting the signal over and over and over again that we're not that invested, we're not going to challenge you, they can drift further and further from what their community would want.
Yes, the possibility of accountability is enough in and of itself to forestall bad behavior in the first place. So the long story short of what we need to do here is actually get people engaged in local politics so that members of legislatures, state and city legislatures, are not insulated in the way they are right now from the consequences of their actions in office. The TLDR here is about building a more engaged political culture, right? Lots of people are what Eitan Hirsch, who is a political scientist at Tufts University, calls political hobbyists. So people who are very engaged in politics in like a spectator way, but who don't actually then show up and do the difficult work of organizing, voting, actually engaging substantively in politics. I think everyone should read his book, which is called Politics is for Power. This is not a plug. I do not know Professor Hirsch. I have never spoken to him. I don't know where you can buy his book. I assume probably on Amazon. But the upshot of his book is that people, specifically liberals, have started treating politics as this kind of spectator sport rather than as something that is actually aimed at garnering, gathering, and exercising political power. And as we have talked about before on this podcast, majorities are for doing things. And you
can't do things until you have a majority, generally speaking.
Generally speaking. Majorities are for doing things. You got to get a majority. You cannot act as if politics is just this spectator sport that you are interested in at an intellectual level. It does not work.
Like the opposite of the hot dog man meme. We're all looking around for someone who will do something about this.
Yeah, literally.
And it's us.
Yes. There is, people will often say online, if you're talking to them and they're like annoying and whatever, they'll be like, the Democratic Party is not coming to save you. And it's like, yeah, the Democratic Party is not coming to save you. But what the fuck are you doing in the meantime, right? And for a lot of people, the answer is actually fuck all, right? Like they are not doing anything politically substantive.
The point of this episode, but as somebody who has worked for the institutional Democratic Party before, the folks who spend the off season keeping the lights on get very angry and very defensive when folks, usually to their left, come in every 4 years and demand the keys to the building. And it's kind of a reasonable, in my estimation, response to say, well, where have you been? If you want power within the Democratic Party, you are the Democratic Party if you show up. And so to those folks who say the Democratic Party is not coming to save you, the Democratic Party has an automatic line on the ballot. Maybe what you should be doing is becoming the Democratic Party.
I think we've talked about this before, where like in most communities, you and like 20 of your leftist friends could become the local Democratic Party in that area. You could show up.
If you wanted to. Nobody runs for precinct committee person. Just you get 3 people to write your name down on their ballot and you're a precinct committee person for the Democratic Party.
It's no
kidding.
It is like genuinely. I'm being totally serious about this. It is actually that easy. Like, we talk about how there are like no magic buttons a lot, how there's lots of different policies that we'll need to do, how like sometimes we need to fundamentally change the structure of like government or society or some kind of like rules about how we run things. But in this particular instance, it really is that fucking easy. Like, you can, with a bunch of your buddies, show up at the local Democratic Party meetings and become the local Democratic Party. It is that simple. And if you don't do that, quite frankly, it's just because you don't want to, right? So anyway, getting off of this long point, because this is something that we've tried in the past, doesn't seem to have worked. It just seems like you can't really get people engaged in, as you said, the off season. Really, really hard to get people engaged between elections. And so the second thing that we should do here is we should try to stop things happening during the off season. Stop these elections happening at this time when people are disengaged, when people do not show up. So we need to get rid of these off-cycle elections. Off-cycle elections, quite frankly, horrible. As we've been over, nobody votes in them. Nobody cares about them. They allow a completely unrepresentative sample of the electorate to decide the direction of a state, a city, a county, etc. It's just bad. It's just bad. Right?
It's just bad because people don't show up. Now, that being said, we're in, again, not to get too current events on this podcast, we're in an interesting situation where it seems like because we don't have new news, off-cycle elections may be getting kind of an outsized amount of play or attention from our political leaders, but the electorate stays small. That's why somebody like Elon Musk comes in and is like, I'm going to give a check to a random person who voted, sort of thing.
Yeah,
it's actually trying to enhance turnout because turnout's so bad.
Yeah, to take the like Wisconsin Supreme Court election that happened this week, right? That election was a historically high turnout election for an off-cycle election, for a Supreme Court election in Wisconsin for this time period. Much higher turnout than normal, right? But the turnout was still 40% below what an average midterm is in the state of Wisconsin. So even though it was this big news story, and everyone who pays attention to politics, who looks at it through this spectator sport lens, was like, oh my God, this is such a big deal. This is very important. Voters are clearly energized. Even though it's a super big deal, fewer people voted in it than are going to vote next year because they just know a midterm election is happening. Right? The people who voted in that election are the most politically engaged people in the
involved.
State, right?
Well, then you've got off-cycle elections, even if, we have elections in May in addition to our November elections. Many states do that. You get an older electorate. I think you get a whiter electorate, and you get a more conservative, more home-owning electorate.
I don't know if the more conservative part is true anymore.
Okay, fair. Yeah.
It absolutely was true throughout most of the 2000s and 2010s. But I think as you've seen the coalitions shift a little bit in the Trump era, off-cycle election electorates are maybe actually a little bit more progressive than they used to be.
Interesting.
But even despite
I'm clearly working on outdated data, but very interesting.
Even despite that fact, right? The fact that they are like more democratic in certain places, or at least in the Trump era, they are more democratic because the out party is motivated, when
maybe it's more majoritarian.
Yeah. But the upshot is that people don't vote in these elections. The electorate is not representative. And in sort of normal political times, which I think you and I sort of both hope we can return to some sort of normal political order one of these days, because if we can't, we're just fully screwed, right? If this seesaw roller coaster thing that we're on is the next 30 years of American politics, then
my blood pressure cannot handle this.
No matter what else happens, we're just totally screwed. And so I think we're operating in a framework where maybe we return a tiny bit to normalcy. We read a headline in the morning and then spend the day drinking when we read blank dead at 79, right?
The best, very, very best thing that could happen right now is actually coffee getting more expensive. That's the silver lining is maybe I will drink less coffee as long as the antidepressants don't get more expensive.
Well,
don't tax my wine. Don't tax my antidepressants.
Well, on that note, no, I will say, so the basic idea is we've been harping on this point for a long time, belaboring the point, I think, honestly.
Yeah,
these off-cycle elections are just not good. Right? They're not good for representation and fidelity. But more broadly on this point, Americans, I think, just vote too much. We are asked to vote for too many things. People are asked to pay too much attention.
They don't.
So they don't. So they check out. Yeah. The only country in the world, practically, that has about as many elections as the United States, in fact, has more elections than the United States, is Switzerland. And they have this crazy, weird, direct democracy culture that they vote on literally everything, including on whether or not people in their neighborhoods are allowed to have citizenship, which is fucking insane. And nothing that works in Switzerland works anywhere else, basically. You look at any graph of here's a country comparison of things, and then here's Switzerland, way off of the trend line. Nothing that works in Switzerland seems to work anywhere else. So perhaps not a model to be looking at. But I would say I would go even further than Americans vote too much, and we should get rid of these off-cycle elections, to say that states shouldn't even have their elections off-cycle in such a way that they are co-occurring with midterms. They should be co-occurring with presidential elections. Elections should be basically a time, right, where people are able to get engaged, where that this is the year where you are going to hold people accountable. And ideally, that allows everyone to focus a little bit more on getting people engaged during this time period, rather than having to try to constantly engage them over the course of every election cycle in a way that I think history has demonstrated just does not work.
It's like when an athlete has a contract year and all of a sudden you're watching their stats very, very closely. Okay, let's see how much money you're going to earn this year.
Yeah, 100%, right? People pay attention when they perceive that things are happening that are important, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And right now, for better or for worse, definitely for worse, but for better or for worse, people just cannot be corralled to pay attention and participate as much as they do in a presidential election year, in off-cycle elections, in midterm election years, in random special elections that happen at various times.
Yeah, absolutely.
It just fundamentally doesn't work. And so getting rid of these elections that happen, these times when we're trying to engage people in a time when they just cannot be fucked to be engaged, that is, I think, a much more doable step than just reorient the entire American political culture to get people engaged.
Okay, so we've got consolidate the attention. Let's talk about a couple other ways that I think we want to maybe compete with the incumbency advantage a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's talk about making districts more competitive.
Yes.
And let's talk about opening primaries, I think, is something that might also serve to make districts more competitive and maybe get away from the incumbency advantage.
Yeah, so I think the first bit of these is aside from all of the other benefits that ending gerrymandering might have, gerrymandering as it is now means that it is quite literally almost impossible to hold a politician accountable in many cases, except for the threat of a well-funded primary challenger. It just makes it functionally impossible. And drawing districts without regard for partisanship, but with regard for the competitiveness of the seat, can really help to forestall the kinds of like losing sight of what the district actually wants that Megan was talking about earlier. Like, again, as we talked about, just the mere fact that accountability might be possible, right, forestalls the bad behavior that the accountability is supposed to be there to correct.
Yep. Accountability is it's not just we want to punish you if you do something we don't like. It's we want you to think about the fact that we could punish you if
you don't do the things we don't like in the first place.
Exactly. So that's thing one, gerrymandering, or at least drawing districts so as to enhance competitiveness on a partisan level, rather than what we do right now, which is draw as many safe seats as possible, basically.
And I think another piece of this, because I think Megan and I are in agreement on this, and I think we've talked about this a little bit on the podcast before, that like single member districts are just dumb in the first place. And we should have a different kind of electoral system here.
It'd just be too wild of a swing for the US, honestly. Can you imagine? But,
Not really. But this is a podcast where we talk about doing big things, not just tinkering around the edges. So I think
that is true. That is very true.
If we want to like hold more politicians accountable, I think something like drawing multi-member districts with like a instant runoff, like a single transferable vote, is helpful for that. Doing something like mixed member proportional districts where you have like smaller districts, and then also a number of the candidates are elected just by list, and so the party themselves can hold bad actors accountable, right? Because you figure if someone is acting in a way that like lots of people in a district are unhappy with, but then they can't manage to hold them accountable, they're also probably pissing off people within the political party itself. And party leadership can remove those people from the list of people who will get seats based on the amount of votes. Anyway, there are different ways that we
there are options. And as much as we talk about how strong it seems like the parties are in the US right now, that's nothing compared with party strength in systems where you have proportional representation or these party list systems in other ways.
Yeah. So we can talk about this maybe in a future episode. Honestly.
Yeah. This might be something for later.
Yeah. But Americans don't have a great sense of just how weak the American party system actually is and just how personalist it is compared to almost every other elective democracy on Earth.
Yep.
Practically. Anyway, not to belabor that point.
That's gerrymandering. Yes. Let's talk about. I do want to keep an eye on time, which is why I'm rushing you. I think we should talk about different primary systems, which could enhance one's ability to be more representative or held more accountable vis-a-vis the entire district, relative to just your partisan, fellow travelers, etc. Many states have closed primaries where only people who are registered members of their party can vote. Some states have open primaries that allow you to move freely between parties, vote for whomever, but you can only vote once in that primary election. You have to pick a party to vote. And some states have everybody on one ballot. And quite frankly, I think that's the way that we all should be going.
There are some unintended consequences, I think, to the top two primary system. Like for instance, they can result in the like actual majority party in an area getting locked out of the general election, which is like not great for representation, right? But that's pretty rare, and I think honestly, it's on party organizers. It's on parties and party organizers to like stop that from happening. But the fundamental piece here, I think, with the top two primary system is that it allows you to register your displeasure with your representative before the general election, even if that representative does not belong to your party, which is impossible to do in a closed primary system, practically. Also, functionally impossible to do in an open primary system, but where you can only vote in one of the two primary elections, right? Because most people are not going to forfeit the opportunity to select the person they want to challenge the incumbent in favor of trying to make sure the incumbent loses the primary, right? So it's like a strategy ordering thing, right?
I think that is why I am so supportive of the quote jungle primary unquote, because I went to undergraduate in Louisiana, where they have been doing this for a long, long time. And sometimes it gets you really bad outcomes, and sometimes it gets you really good outcomes. So, we see.
Yeah, and I think especially if you sort of couple this top two primary system with a more competitive district environment, a slightly higher level of engagement, having these primaries take place in election years, like where the president is being elected, where like national level politics are also happening, it becomes a little bit less likely that these negative consequences rear their ugly heads, because insofar as primary electorates are also unrepresentative, you still have, more representative primary electorates than you would in these off-cycle elections. And then you could even consider going one step further than, having primary elections be top two and then the general election months later, and just have, like Louisiana does, the person if you get more than 50% in that election, there's just no general.
And then the primary is on the general election day, and the runoff is later.
Yes.
Which is how they do it in Louisiana. I think it's how Georgia works as well.
Yes, I believe Georgia does work this way. I don't know exactly I think Georgia might have a 3-step process.
Yeah,
I
remember this vaguely.
You have primary elections, then you have the general election, and in the general election, if nobody gets over 50%, then you have another runoff. Whereas what Louisiana does is there is no primary. Everyone who is qualified to get on the ballot is on the ballot. And then in Georgia, there's almost always a runoff. But the election where you have more than 50% gets you elected, less than 50% gets you a runoff, happens on the day of the midterm or the presidential election. I think honestly that is would be a better way, probably, at least to handle the incumbency advantage, right? That part of what term limits are supposed to do.
Right.
As opposed to all of the other stuff that they are intended to accomplish, which they might be a little less effective at. But changing the election structure, changing the incentive structure so that you have to cater to a general election electorate basically at all times, rather than just catering to this group of political weirdos, quite frankly. That I think also forestalls the bad behavior and also hopefully makes the incumbency advantage less salient.
I think that's an important note. Also to note that we know from things like conjoint studies, which are basically, for the uninitiated, studies that make you choose between two options, basically. We know that people are likely to forgive an awful lot of bad behavior from somebody who's from their same party if the alternative is voting for somebody from the other party. So it's going to be difficult, which is why you see so many times, a representative who's been there for 20 terms, even though, as I joked at the top, many, many people say they don't want people to camp out in their legislative seats. They keep voting for the person who's camped out in the seat because that person represents the same party that they want to see in Congress or their state legislature. So to create a system where you're reducing kind of that likelihood that you are going to wind up voting for either the person who has been there a long time or someone you disagree with, I think this is one way that we mitigate that. I do want to offer another way that I think we mitigate that. Being a member of Congress, being a member of the state legislature is not something that you earn for working really hard for the party for your whole life. The idea that it's so-and-so's turn or so-and-so gets to be a member of Congress as a reward for loyal service, etc. Or it would be disrespectful to so-and-so to run a primary campaign against them, even though they are no longer representative of the district, is something that we have to get away from, especially in the Democratic Party.
Yes, this like seniority system, basically, where
yes,
the phrase "it's their turn" is really baked into a lot of Democratic Party politics, where it's like, oh, this person is lying in wait. Like when so-and-so retires, their chief of staff is going to get the party's support, right? That needs to stop happening, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There was a situation in, I think, a district that represents Houston, Texas, where a member died of cancer, and then the person elected to replace them, had cancer as well, and then was elected because it was his turn. Passed away in office. Now that vacancy is going to be held open until the November election, and the people of Houston don't have a member of Congress. I don't know that was the optimal result.
And I also think that like a lot of this ends up where like you are running a person who is not the strongest candidate for the district because it is their turn, right? Like, this is an exhortation to any Democratic Party political operatives who listen to our podcast. Like, cut that shit out maybe a little bit. Like,
as we have a public that is telling you we need younger people, we are losing, the Democratic Party is losing young voters, and some of the most electric communicators and the people who really are acting on behalf of their constituents are the young women in Congress. On both sides of the aisle, quite frankly. I don't think I agree with Anna Paulina Luna about anything other than the fact that women who have just given birth should be able to vote by proxy. These are the people who your constituents are telling you they want to have the opportunity to vote for. So if all you are willing to put forward and give institutional support to is a person in their senior years who has already served the party faithfully for such and such period of time, you're losing that support.
Yeah.
And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe that person wins the general anyway, but it's going to have consequences further on down the road, and we're starting to reap them.
And I think to sort of close us out here, to bring us way back up to the top of like, what we're trying to avoid here is bringing people into office who are like megalomaniacs obsessed with power, right? Getting rid of this institutional arrangement where if you serve the party faithfully for a number of years, you get rewarded with power. Like, that attracts people who are interested in power into those roles. Perhaps over and above the people who we say we want to incentivize to join those roles, people who actually have this deep intrinsic public service motivation, right? If it is no longer understood that your reward for serving the party faithfully for many years is you get power, then that does a lot to disincentivize that kind of person from being the kind of person who ends up in these positions in the first place, which again forestalls people behaving badly in the first place, which is what we all basically agree we want. Like, that is the end goal of what term limits are supposed to do in the first place and what they are not actually achieving. Because everything about the institutional arrangements, from the electoral process to the institutional support to what term limits incentivize people to do once they are in office, incentivizes people who are interested in power rather than in actually serving their constituents. That is the incentive. And people are going to follow their incentives more often than not. But until we manage to do all of those things, until we can reorient American political culture, get rid of these off-cycle elections, fix our electoral institutions and our political institutions, until we manage to solve some of those problems in a way that will accomplish what term limits are supposed to, without all of their unintended consequences. Until then, I have been Clayton Becker.
I have been Megan Cox.
And we will see you guys on the next one.